So as I believe you were just all notified on your screens that this webinar is being recorded, and I will share a little bit more about that in a moment. I'm going to share my screen. Alrighty, well, we are at noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm really happy to introduce, if you do not already know, Carolyn Heaps-Beccaro and Matt Dallin of DCR, and today they will be sharing their work in regards to state-led flood resilience planning. This webinar is it is certified for CM credit. You can find the number here, and I'll also put it in the chat box in just a moment. So along with that link in the chat box, I'll also put the link to our chapter website page and to our conference page. Quick plug for our conference, which will be held in July in Williamsburg. And actually, Carolyn will be speaking at that as well in one of our breakout sessions. So I will put that in the chat box as well. We really do encourage questions, but please submit your questions through the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box. This will just help us keep track of all inquiries. You can also, during the more formal portion during the more formal Q&A portion of the webinar, you can use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted if you'd prefer to ask it out loud. But otherwise, please put all questions through the Q&A box. If you have any logistical questions, feel free to direct message me using the chat feature. And at some points there may be time for open-ended engagement, which you can use the chat box. And also in just a little bit, we will be doing some polling, and that will populate on your screen and should be pretty straightforward. But again, please let me know if you have any questions. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. I will share the link to our chapter YouTube page where you can find all previously recorded webinars in the series and this one in the coming days. But otherwise, I will hand it over and thank you everyone for joining.
Great. Thank you, Jillian.
No problem.
Share my screen. All right. So Matt and I, we've already been introduced. We're really excited to be here with you all today to share some information about what we're doing here at DCR with respect to resilience planning. So we are a three-person team, Matt, myself, and Arthur Kay, who's recently joined us as another resilience planner supporting this work. We do work within the Department of Conservation and Recreation. So we are one office focused on flood resilience work. There's also our floodplain management team and our dam safety team located within DCR that you might be familiar with, also addressing flooding in slightly different ways. As we get started here, as Jillian mentioned, we wanted to do a quick poll. We've got 3 different poll questions that you'll see come up on your screen in just the next couple of minutes or seconds. The first one we're asking is organizational affiliation. So tell us who you work for. And then after we get responses to this, there'll be 2 more questions, one of which has to do with the map that you see here on the screen. So I'll give folks just a second to respond before we close it. Okay, great. So it looks like we've got most folks joining us today are either from local governments or from consulting firms. Also have some PDCs and state government as well. Those are the major kind of categories we see. So thanks, everybody. The second question is about where you're from in the state. So using this map here on the screen, if you could tell us which of these regions you live or work in, if you do live or work in the Commonwealth. And we'll give folks just another minute or so to answer this. All right, so 58%, the majority are Piedmont region, which is great. And also the second highest is coastal. And There were some not applicables, but the rest mountains and valleys. All right, thank you. Last question. Are you familiar with the Coastal Resilience Master Plan? Yes, no, not sure. All right. And majority are not familiar, 62%, followed by 32% yes, familiar, and 6% not sure. Well, for you knows, you will be familiar at least a little bit after our presentation today, so that's great. Glad to have so many people on the line that aren't familiar, and hopefully you all will find many of the tools we're sharing useful, if not directly for your work in general, in terms of thinking about resilience planning. Okay, moving on. So today in our webinar, we're hoping to cover two major topics. Firstly, I'm going to set the stage a little bit for the tools and products we'll describe that DCR is either developing, in the process of developing right now, or already developed to support local flood resilience planning, by sharing some information about what we do when it comes to flood resilience planning here at DCR, as well as kind of what the major flood challenges that we're trying to address are. We're hoping you come away from this with a better understanding of what's happening at the state level to plan for the impacts of flooding, and also some knowledge of the tools and products that might be helpful for supporting your own flood resilience planning efforts. We will have time for Q&A both at the end and also midway during the presentation, as Matt and I kind of hand things over between the two of us. All right, so just setting the stage a little bit, I think most of us are familiar with flooding challenges in Virginia. But we know that, the way that flooding looks in the different parts of the state can be quite different. This is an image of a home in the aftermath of Hurricane Camille back in 1969 in Nelson County. And obviously this was a major kind of extreme event, causing some severe damage in that part of the state. And then kind of the other side of the spectrum, both geographically and in terms of the challenge, this is a photo from Hampton, Virginia, taken in May of 2022, so about 2 years ago, showing some of our sunny day tidal flooding conditions impacting business. This is a water-dependent industry here with the seafood company bringing in seafood by truck and also experiencing flooding on the dock and on the roadway. So this kind of illustrates the differences between flooding across the different geographies and also the different types of flooding and the kind of the spectrum of impacts we can experience here in Virginia, from more chronic, like that sea level rise kind of picture we just saw, to the more acute risks like the hurricane event from 1969, and even these more recent examples in the past 4 years of flooding in Southwest Virginia and the impacts that we've seen there as a result of really extreme precipitation events. So the impacts of flooding are both chronic and acute in nature. There's, of course, different flood sources that I think many of us are familiar with. We've got rainfall-driven flooding or pluvial flooding, riverine flooding from our rivers overtopping, as well as those more flash flood type of events in both our river channels and our streams. And we've also got tidal flooding and storm surge on our coasts. And of course, all of these are influenced by the changing landscapes of water in our environment. So we know, of course, many people are familiar with impacts of sea level rise. This graphic on the left is kind of illustrating the changing nature of sea level rise, not only for those day-to-day experiences like we saw in the image of Hampton, where the daily experiences of high tides can just be a chronic kind of stressor on how we do business or how we work in our cities, but also can change the picture of the extent and depth of future extreme coastal events. So how far inland that water is coming and how much land gets exposed over time to those impacts. And you can see that illustrated in the chart on the right. Both of these are excerpts from the Phase 1 Coastal Resilience Master Plan, which was released back in 2021. But in addition to sea level rise, we also have impacts from changing precipitation patterns. So those kind of impacts of climate change on flooding are not limited to the coast, and scientists are forecasting an increase in precipitation across Virginia, especially in central Virginia and areas that already experience a high number of flood events. So This map is taken from research out of the RAND Corporation affiliated with the Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Group, or MRISA. And it shows the percent difference in precipitation 3 to 6 decades from now as compared to the historic kind of 1981 to 2010 normal. So it's important thinking about all of these different changes for how these different influences of flooding are shifting as a result of climate change. It's important that we account for these kind of long-term shifts in our long-range planning processes. But flooding matters to us because it impacts us, right? It impacts our livelihoods, our people, the economy, the environment, and it's influenced it's both influenced by and also impacts the built and natural environment. So this image shows kind of our different infrastructure, our different assets throughout the landscape, and we can start to see how these are both things that how they're developed can influence how flooding occurs, but also how flooding might impact, disrupt or incapacitate some of these assets. So when we think about planning, we're thinking about both the kind of the physical nature of where flooding occurs and where it's likely to occur, but then also the assets that exist in the landscape that are likely to be impacted. However, we also know those assets aren't necessarily static. So over time, as planners, we think a lot about population growth and population change. So this is an image of that historic census counts for Virginia, as well as some forward-looking data from the Weldon Cooper Center. And then we can also think about where population growth or the opposite is likely to occur or has occurred in the past throughout the Commonwealth. So similarly, this is a picture of population migration. So those assets and where they exist is, of course, not static. It follows where population exists and development is occurring. So we can understand this through land cover data, for example. This is historic backward-looking land cover change data. But thinking about kind of forward-looking, where can we expect future development to occur, and where is that likely to intersect with where we know flooding is likely to be occurring and changing in the future? So our role here is to really think about those two kind of questions and then try to plan ahead for a more flood resilient future and a more flood resilient Commonwealth. You can see our charge and our definition of flood resilience on the screen here. But I wanted to highlight that, until fairly recently, the state didn't play a huge role in addressing this kind of changing picture of flood risk. So when we think about the climate impacts on flooding, more of that, historically speaking, was happening at a locality level than happened at the state scale. And that kind of changed with the Coastal Resilience Master Plan framework document, as well as the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. And now, of course, we have as our mission in this office to address that through our planning products, which I'll talk about in just a second. So, of course, we don't do this in a vacuum. As I was talking about all of these other assets that exist in the Commonwealth, we know that many of these other assets are either owned by or managed by, supported by different state agency programs and activities, as well as, of course, those different levels of government, private sector, et cetera. It's a whole community of stakeholders involved in our flood resilience and our flood assets. But particularly as this work ramps up from Commonwealth-led flood resilience planning, there's a need to better coordinate state agency action between those state agencies, but also with these other levels of governance in the state. And that's what primarily what I wanted to speak to today before we get into the tools. So just as some background on the two plans. So we are charged with currently developing two plans, the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, which the next phase of is due at the end of this year. So phase 2 is due in December of 2024. For those of you who indicated you were familiar with the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, this image should look familiar. This is the phase 1 plan that was released in December of 2021. So what we're currently working on is an update to this place-specific plan seeking to mitigate severe and repetitive flooding in our coastal region. In addition, we're responsible for developing our flood protection master plan for the Commonwealth. This one's due at the end of next year, and so we're starting to engage in this planning process now. Here, what we're trying to achieve is more of a strategic plan for state government to use in crafting our policies, and programs that, again, mitigate the impacts of flooding on people, the economy, and the environment. So strategic plans are, of course, not new for state government, but in the floodplain management or flood resilience space, this hasn't been done for the Commonwealth since 2005. And even at that time, it was primarily a strategic plan for one team within DCR and not a cross-cutting agency strategic plan. So as we think about the different kind of responsibility and ownership and the changing nature of this problem that's shared across state agencies, we're working to try to develop a planning process that is more shared across these different agencies and informed by the wide network of existing efforts underway across the state. As we've been working towards developing this planning process and thinking ahead to this plan that hasn't been done in 20 years, and even then is kind of a deviation from what we've done historically, we've been looking to other states and other resources to help us understand how to best develop this integrated flood resilience planning approach. I just wanted to share a couple of the different audiences that we've looked to for information. Texas has an interesting approach to flood resilience. If you're interested in learning more about what's happening at state levels across the country, would recommend checking out their flood resilience model. And then also the State Resilience Partnership, and particularly coordinating with American Flood Coalition, has been helpful for us to think through what are some of the best practices in this state. And they have a state flood resilience checklist that's been kind of a useful guide as well. So what we've come up with is this cohesive picture of thinking about planning that should occur at the state level to inform state policies and programs and funding, connected down to the local level, where we know that local flood resilience planning is already happening and has been happening in some cases for many years, to develop place-based strategies at the local level. And between those two, currently we've got one coastal resilience master plan. Our only regional plan is the Coastal Resilience Master Plan at the moment. This can help serve kind of the connective tissue between these two different scales of plans. And potentially, there might be an opportunity in the future for additional regional master plans. That has been discussed, but not decided on yet. And we imagine that'll be a piece of discussing the development of the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan over the next year and a half. So this slide is a little text heavy. So it gets pretty into the weeds in how we're thinking about the integrated nature of this planning processes. The slides will be available in the recording, I believe, after this presentation. So I won't walk through all of the details now, but just to kind of explain, we've got the local flood resilience planning all the way on the right column, where, of course, this will be familiar with many of you on the line, as you are affiliated with local governments and consulting firms that I imagine are already doing this work, or at least thinking about it. And so here we've got local governments as really the owners and implementers, and thinking about local projects, local policies, local programs, and financing strategies for all of those things. For engagement, you might involve communities, neighborhoods, individual residents, et cetera. On the opposite side of the spectrum, all the way on the left-hand side, we've got the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. So here, this is a statewide plan led by state agencies, and really 4 state agencies to implement, thinking about state policies, state programs, and state funding or financing strategies. This requires understanding and outreach and engagement of a variety of scales, particularly other state agencies, our different regions, and local governments within this sector. Between those two, we've got the Coastal Resilience Master Plan and those kind of potential future regional master plans that would include kind of connecting the needs assessment between the two, but could also serve a space between the two where state agencies and state government is helping to identify those challenges and opportunities that are larger just than an individual locality and could serve the needs of multiple localities or an entire region. For the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan in particular, we're working through this planning cycle as our kind of baseline, our framework for developing this plan. The input data is primarily our flood hazard and our asset data. One of the major challenges to developing this plan is that we don't currently have similar flood hazard data for all parts of the state. So in some areas, we have only very old FEMA flood hazard mapping products that don't incorporate all flood hazard sources and don't incorporate information about climate impacts on flood hazards. And then in other areas of the state, we have highly detailed and forward-looking climate projections. So we need to think about how to fill that kind of data gap as we're coming up with a strategic plan to ensure that all of the regions of the Commonwealth are reflected in both kind of accurate and forward-looking data. What we're currently looking at for this is potential to leverage some third-party flood hazard data products, and we've discussed this with a variety of stakeholders through our Coastal Resilience Technical Advisory Committee to help us better get that picture statewide of what the flood hazard really looks like. When it comes to the flood impact summary, I talked about the need to not just understand assets as they currently exist, but also thinking ahead to how those assets might change in response to population. And so here we have the opportunity to incorporate scenario planning into our planning process, to use different potential kind of looks of what the future might end up looking like, knowing that things are likely to not turn out exactly as we think, to have a few different scenarios and to use some of that forward-looking population and land use data to help inform our flood impact summaries as we go into developing strategies. So I won't talk through every element of this in detail. I do want to highlight that we are planning for stakeholder outreach and engagement throughout the process. This is particularly geared towards other state agencies that will be responsible for implementation. But we also want to be engaging with localities and other key stakeholders to understand more about the challenges and opportunities and where capacity currently exists, particularly to help inform that flood resilience gaps analysis that then feeds into our policy and program strategy for implementation. So I'm going to pause there before we switch over to talk about our tools and resources and just see if there's any questions for this portion of the presentation. And we can also, of course, answer anything at the end. Jillian, I'm not able to see just because of how our screen setup is. I can't see the Q&A. So if there is anything that comes through, would you mind just reading it out loud?
Yep, no problem. And right now there aren't any in the queue. And again, we might actually have just gotten one. But before I go ahead and read this one, I just wanted to remind everyone, please put those through the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box. And as Carolyn mentioned, we will also have time to do questions at the end as well. But Elizabeth Nowak, I apologize if I'm getting any of the pronunciations of the names wrong, asks, how are you integrating or identifying historical and cultural resources?
That's a great question. For the Coastal Resilience Master Plan in particular, we've been working closely with the Department of Historic Resources to try to gather data from them in terms of a very kind of quantitative approach to developing that asset base for our impact assessments. So leveraging some of their existing data sets, in part, because they are good data sets that already exist, but also to help create some cohesion between the programs. And ultimately, hopefully, what we produce with the Coastal Resilience Master Plan can help inform the data, and the findings can help inform their kind of programmatic decisions moving forward, which is possible by using their data, or more likely to happen by using their data. On the qualitative side, we're also doing engagement, particularly with planning district commissions and some local government staff, to try to make sure that we're accurately capturing kind of the picture of flood impacts and challenges in the region. And so we want, not just to include this really the hard data of where those resources exist, but also some of the stories that go along with the challenges. And so hoping that through that process, we're able to highlight additional cultural and historic resources that and kind of the stories behind the challenge in addition to the quantitative side of things. And then for the statewide plan, we haven't yet defined the exact approach. We are looking at leveraging the asset data that we've collected for the coastal plan, so we're not kind of reinventing the wheel where it makes sense. And so that's something that we would look at developing that strategy.
And we actually just got another question. Mary Berta Cogshall is asking, do you use ESRI for mapping floodplain? And I'm not sure if there's a different, if you're supposed to say the acronym or not. I'm not in the field, but Carolyn, I'm sure can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, so Esri products, yeah. Yes, we do. Do you want to talk about that, Matt?
Yes, I mean, Esri is our main products, and we can also use a QGIS, but I'll talk about some of the different data products that we have available and that we're working on developing, that are public resources. So they are, yes, supporting our planning effort, but we also want this data to be a resource for those that are planning at the local scale, for businesses, for nonprofits, and other stakeholders, that they have this forward-looking flood hazard data as a resource and spend more time on the planning and less time on the data production.
Great.
Alrighty, we actually are getting a couple more in. I don't want to cut too much into your second part of
Yeah.
the presentation, but Harrison Preman is asking, in regards to mapping, are there any plans or discussions on publishing interactive maps?
Yes, and let's talk more about the mapping after Matt goes into his slides, because he has some that show actually some of the mapping products that we've already developed, and then we can answer any questions about what's coming. So I think in the interest of time, let's go into his, and I think the questions are going there anyway. So let's go through Matt's slides and then we'll have more time for questions after his.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. Good morning, everybody. Here to talk to you about the different resources and tools that we've been working at DCR to support, again, our planning efforts, but also your planning efforts, hopefully, as well. Just looking through the planning cycle, we are working across multiple phases with regards to the data and tools. So our data collection, understanding where is the flooding and where is that flooding intersecting, so collecting the data on the flood hazards as well as the assets, combining the two and saying, well, what are the impacts of that assets being exposed to flooding? We'll talk about the flood hazard impact assessment that we've done for the coastal plan and that we're doing for the update. We are collecting resilience strategies. By and large, DCR is not the implementer of these plans. We are not out building projects, building flood walls, or implementing different policies and procedures. A lot of this implementation is coming from localities and PDCs. So we're trying to collect that information so that we, as well as others, can see what else is going on to try to be more effective and efficient as in the implementation plan. And we're also developing tools for our stakeholder outreach and engagement. And that's one I'll speak to lastly, is our new flood story app that we worked with our floodplain management division on working. So without that, I'll start kind of going through this process. First up, Coastal Resilience Master Plan. You'll see the image on the right. This is the limits of our plan. It looks different than the coastal figure shown up front because our coastal plan is for the 8 coastal PDCs. So that includes Powhatan, Goochland, communities that don't see themselves as coastal. They're still included in this planning effort. Phase 1 focused on the coastal flood hazard data, and we'll share some of that data that's available. But as we're moving forward into phase 2, we're really working a lot on rainfall-driven flood hazards. And that impacts all of us across the Commonwealth, but we're just developing the data right now in this 8 coastal PDC region. And so with those inputs, we'll get into the impacts later. So this is a screenshot from our Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. It's up on our website that you can access it. This is an interactive data viewer. You can zoom in to any location in our coastal plan area and see what flood hazard impacts look like, not only today, but into the future out to 2080 across multiple scenarios. So where you might have seen NOAA's sea level rise viewer that shows sea level rise over time, this viewer has sea level rise plus storm surge on top of that sea level rise in the future to try to give you a better understanding of that risk that can occur in the future, not only from our repetitive tidal flooding, but as well as from those extreme storm events that can happen in the future as well. And so this shows click on any point on the map, it shows your exposure over time with regards to the return interval or the annual exceedance probability. So the point selected on the map shows how that block in that neighborhood in Alexandria right now is in 100-year floodplain, but in the future, they're going to be in the 2-year floodplain and experiencing a lot more repetitive flooding. So this gives us some more context to think about long-term planning efforts. So a little bit more detail on this coastal flood hazard data. We have a lot of it, and so we show some of it in the Web Explorer, and that is a graduated floodplain where you can see the different exposure probabilities for a certain region with a certain time horizon. In addition to those graduated floodplains, we have all of the kind of underlying data for that in 10-foot raster mosaics. We have depth grids with and without waves, and we also have water surface elevations. So if you have a specific kind of planning interval, if you're not interested in all 9 or 10 water levels that we have that underlying data. If you just wanted to say use the 25, 100, and 500 or some different combination, that data all exists. And there's different ways to access it, but the easiest way, if you don't know, is to reach out to us. So again, just a little bit more detail on this coastal data. The recurrence water levels, we've got tidal water, mean high and mean low. Those are both in the viewer. We also have the 1.5 mean tide range. This layer that we have in there is not a regulatory layer, but that 1.5 mean tide range is used for regulation in the coastal zone. But we didn't include it because it has some overlap with the 2-year. So again, just additional data that is out there and available for use. And we all would love for you all to start incorporating this data. This data is at 20-year time horizon, so 2020 out to 2100. 2100 is not in the viewer, but we have the data. All of this uses NOAA's 2017 intermediate high relative sea level rise projection. And so one of the ways to access this data is through an open data hub, through an Esri website that's shown on the screen right now. That has some links to some products that you can use ArcGIS Online to just pull it into the maps. We also have links to the raw raster data, which is housed in Amazon's open data portal, which we provide a link to so that you can access that raster data and do more analysis with it. But if you just need to view it, we have different layers that are shared through some different published services, so you can just view that data. So this is one of the examples of some of those hosted data layers that are available publicly to use. You can either use it with ArcGIS Online or through desktop, whether it's Pro or ArcMap. So these data layers, again, are available. If you have questions or if it's not working for you or you need it some different way, please let us know. We developed these data layers to support our planning efforts. We're hopeful that they're a resource to others. We do want to know if it's not meeting your use case or your need, if there's something we can do. This coastal plan, along with our state plan, needs to be updated every 5 years. So we might not be able to update it right now for you, although we can try to evaluate and see if we can. But when it comes time to do this effort again, and if we're creating new data, the more we understand from potential stakeholders on what your need is, how you would like to use the data, how you would like to access the data, the better service we can provide to you all. So please let us know what works, what doesn't work. We're always happy to hear feedback. So this is actually an example of somebody that has used our data in their planning products. This is Hampton's, I can't read this.
Hampton 2040 community plan.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. So Hampton was able to pull in our hosted data layers, put them into the viewer, create figures for it that are just within Hampton and make it its way into their own planning efforts. So this is another great example that we hope could be replicated elsewhere in either local planning efforts, whether it's a comp plan, regional hazard mitigation plans, local resilience plans. There's a lot of planning going on. Again, please try to use this available resource so that more time can be spent on the planning, less time on the data production for it. But we know and acknowledge that phase one of the coastal plan just focused on coastal flood hazard data. We had some budgetary and schedule constraints, but we know that the coastal flood hazard isn't the total flood hazard. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's people on this webinar today that might be in our coastal plan, but planning area, but didn't see any value of the products because they're further inland, right? And we didn't have that, but we're working on incorporating the major sources of flooding into our phase two effort. So data is coming soon in the future. And so I'm going to talk about a little bit about what that new data is going to be looking like. So I mentioned earlier for phase two, we're working on rainfall-driven flooding. So this impacts all of us. We've been working with our consultant Dewberry to model this using HEC-RAS 2D models of when the rain falls on the ground, where is it accumulating, and ponding and flooding before it really gets to a major open water conveyance source, whether it's a river or a stream. So we've completed this modeling effort, and now we're using all those models and the depth grids from the models to create pluvial or rainfall-driven planning scenarios. The way we're looking at these planning scenarios, a little different from our coastal data from phase one, is two planning horizons, a near future and a far future planning horizons with two different risk tolerances. So a moderate risk tolerance, kind of everyday planning, we kind of want to set that as the baseline. And then there's a low risk tolerance, which we want to have a higher flood depth because you may not be able to accept that amount of risk, primarily for, let's say, critical infrastructure. If major roadway or critical building is flooded, that could have widespread impacts. Maybe we want to look at the more conservative value on the lower risk. So we're trying to represent a range of options of risk tolerance across two different planning horizons, near future and far future, and that incorporates climate change. So we know precipitation values are increasing, and we're building that into our planning scenarios as we look forward. So not only will the planning scenario data be available, the underlying depth grids for our model runs are available, as well as the models themselves are available for download so that people can rerun their scenario if our precipitation values don't necessarily align with what they're doing, or they want to experiment and see if we put in this different structure, what would that impact be to the different where flooding is showing up. That will, again, that's another resource that we're putting out there and making that available to the public to download and use this information. So going from now, where is it flooding to what are the impacts of the flooding? This is a screenshot from our Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. Within the Web Explorer, there's tabs across the top: intro, hazard, impacts, community context, projects. This is on the impacts tab. And within the impacts, we've broken out those impacts across community resources, critical sectors, natural infrastructure. And then within those groups, if you see on the left underneath 2060, that's highlighted, there's a drop down for impact type. This is the composite impact type. There's a list of probably 10 to 15, almost 20 different impact types across those community, critical, and natural infrastructure. That's a lot more data that is summarized there's usually a figure below, and that's summarized based on your area of interest, whether it's the Commonwealth, which is our planning area, or PDC or locality. And that data is also available to download those tabular impacts data is available to download below, so you all can have access to it, make figures and graphs with it. So this is an example. It's an Excel table of what this some of the impact data that's available. It's got the different PDC and locality, then our metrics and at what time frame. And you can use some pivot tables and pivot charts to try to take this data and put it into your planning products as well. And so if you have any questions about this, please let us know. Some improvements that we're doing on the impacts for phase 2. We're also going to be doing this reporting per watershed. So using the HUC, kind of different HUC scales to report impacts across watersheds. The other addition is that we're also going to be having reporting at the town level. For the coastal plan phase 1, we just did counties and cities, and then up to PDCs, and then up to our plan areas. We're also going to have data summaries available for towns as well. So now, gotten through the hazard, the impacts, what are we doing about it? And that is part of our projects and initiatives tab on the Web Explorer, which was great for phase 1. We got had a data call and heard from a lot of our locality stakeholders and partners what they're doing. We didn't have the access and ability to update that list, so we now can continue to update that. We've added close to 200 more projects since phase 1, projects and initiatives, and all of that information is now available through our what we call our user portal for the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. Individuals need to sign up for this. There's a form that you can submit and get access to this information. That access allows you to add and edit projects. And it also allows you to download some more of the information about these projects that may not be readily available through the Web Explorer. So here is an example of just when you in the Web Explorer, you're able to download all this data and you get all the fields that we have. So if you're giving us information, we're providing an avenue to give it back to you all so you can continue to use it both in tabular form as well as you can download the shape files that are in this too. But similar to the impacts, you can filter and sort this data to try to meet your use case. So here are some of the implementation costs that we have for some different studies and data tools that are listed in the Web Explorer. So again, let us know what your use case is. If we're not meeting it with our how the data is shared and hosted, please let us know so we can try to make improvements over time to help meet this community of need. Next up, so now we've heard about the flooding, the impacts, what everybody's doing about it. Now we also want to hear from different individuals of not only where does it flood, but how does flooding impact you? Gathering these stories has always been a challenge. You often hear about it in face-to-face meetings with individuals, but kind of documenting that, tracking that, incorporating that into the plan can be a challenge. So we worked with our Division of Floodplain Management on a new flood story application where we're collecting this information online, where anybody can go online, drop a pin on the map, and provide some information about either a recent event that just happened or a chronic location where this intersection always floods. My neighborhood floods once a year here, maybe it's once a week, but we can start collecting this information. We can start sharing this information. Again, this isn't only a tool that DCR can leverage. You all can leverage it within your locality, within wherever your planning scale is. If you promote this and try to collect this flood information, we can work with you to share it so you have access to some of the information that we collect so that it's being incorporated into plans. What we're trying to do is provide these tools and resources specifically for those that don't have them right now and don't have the resources and capacity to build these tools. I don't think we need 100 of these tools across the Commonwealth to all meet the same objective. So we're trying to provide state resources that can help the greater need, but we do acknowledge that some of these tools already exist. So A similar effort was done out in Hampton Roads, down in Norfolk, where they're collecting input from the community. Not only what are the challenges and beyond flooding, pollution, transportation, heat, but also what are critical assets. So this kind of public engagement using online tools and surveys is something we're trying to leverage, but not just to have it and forget about it, but to have it, share that information, and try to incorporate it into our planning processes as a better way to say that we've heard from the public, that we understand what their challenges are, and have a better understanding of their perspective, and so that that perspective kind of makes its way into the planning process. So there's a lot of information there. If you have any questions on the data, what we're doing or what we've done, you can either email us at flood.resilience@dcr.gov. Another great way to find out what we're doing, because we are still kind of working on developing and releasing more data, more tools, and more resources, is to sign up for our newsletter. Carolyn puts out a quarterly newsletter for our office that shares a lot of great, valuable information. So I'd encourage you to, if you can't click the link, type in the link and sign up for our quarterly newsletter as well. And so with that, I guess we can open it back up to the next round of questions.
Yes, well, we have had a few come in. I will first go to a question that had come in towards the end of the first round. It was a follow-up question in regards to the historic resources from Elizabeth Nowak. Elizabeth is asking, are the historic or cultural, excuse me, resources being identified as part of critical infrastructure?
Yeah, so in the coastal plan in particular, we haven't yet fully grouped out what all of the different categories are going to be in terms of like getting from the level of an individual asset up to the level of groups like critical or natural. So that process isn't fully complete yet, but we are leaning towards and have been working towards developing kind of, I would say, 3 major categories: the critical built infrastructure, critical human infrastructure, and critical natural infrastructure. And so the cultural and historic resources may fall within the human infrastructure. It can also be categorized as a community resource. We haven't landed on a final decision on that yet, but would be interested, Elizabeth, if you have a recommendation for us, we'd be happy to consider it.
And then on that critical infrastructure side, VDEM has stood up a critical infrastructure program again, and they're using the CISA definition for the different critical infrastructure sectors. So we're trying to, where others are doing this work, where we're not the only ones dealing with flood resilience planning, understanding what others are doing, especially across state governments, to try to align that and move that forward.
Alrighty. And did you have anything else to add in regards to Harrison's question regarding mapping and discussions about publishing the interactive maps? I know you had touched on it.
We have a lot of maps, and the open data portal has some of those hosted interactive maps and different layers that you can use. If you have any specific needs, if what we're sharing isn't what you need, or you're interested in something else or a different way to access the data, I'd say the best way is just to reach out to us directly, and we can work on getting you what you need.
Alrighty. Well, and in line with that, I will also just note that we will be sharing the emails to, or Matt and Carolyn's emails in the follow-up correspondence with all attendees, and I know that they're happy to be a resource. Jessica Lassiter is asking, can you share where to find the assumptions for the rainfall-driven model, please?
Yes, so those models just were created, and we're working on the technical documentation and the report that provides all the background for all the assumptions going into the rainfall-driven models. So that is something that is pending, but not yet available. That will be an appendix to the phase 2 plan, and that will be available on our website, as well as where the models are shared to be downloaded. We'll have that documentation available. We're also working on a user's guide for that for the rainfall-driven models to try to show and demonstrate how these models can be useful beyond what we just did. So try to share some of the additional use cases, both for the depth grid products from the models as well as for the models themselves. And so that's another product that we're hoping to release in this fall.
Alrighty. Mary Berta Cogshow was asking about funding, and I don't have any further context. I know it was as you were wrapping up your portion of the presentation, Matt, perhaps when you were speaking on the app item. I'm not sure, but Mary, feel free to drop any further information in regards to this question. Unless Matt, you know what she's speaking about.
I don't, but we do acknowledge that what needs to be done is not free, both on the implementation side and local planning efforts. So we are trying to understand what the funding need is through the projects and initiatives database to understand what everybody's needs are. There is some state funding available through the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, specifically for flood resilience, and there's some set aside for low-income geographic areas where that's going to support planning. So yes, funding is a big challenge, but there is money out there to help move this forward. And if you have more specifics, we can talk about that later.
Okay.
And Jillian, we can see the questions now, so we can also help you read through them and answer them in real time. So I see Jessica had another question about the Flood Story app. Is it available now? What's the timeline? So yes, that Flood Story app is available online on DCR's website. And I can drop a link in the chat to where to find that. And in terms of the timeline, we are planning to keep it up indefinitely. We don't have like a closing date for when it would stop collecting inputs. So it is going to be open and live. Right now, we're planning, as long as people are finding it useful, and we're finding it useful. So definitely, if you are able to use it and have any feedback on it, we'd welcome your comments. And if you do end up using some of the data or would like to use some of the data, of course, reach out to us. And then if you do use it, we'd love to hear how you're using it.
All right, I'll go to the next question. Was all of this work undertaken in-house, or did you use consultants? Yes, we use consultants. There's no way that it was a team of one, then a team of two, then a team of three were able to do all of this work. So we do have consultants. Dewberry was our phase one consultant. They're still under contract, and we have 4 consultant teams that are now helping us for the next 3 years at least to assist with this work. So we are not doing a lot of this. We're helping manage this and move it forward. So we are very thankful for the consultant support that we've been provided. And lastly, is the flood social vulnerability index layer in the Coastal Resilience Master Plan available as an ArcGIS online layer? I know we can download as an Excel spreadsheet, but it'd be great to use that. Yes, and I believe it's a listed site, and if not, we can figure out how to get it to you. So that's public data. So if you can't access it now, and I believe you can through our open data portal. If you can't, let us know. We will figure it out. Arthur, our new team member, is a data whiz and knows AGOL in and out and can really help us get this information out to you all. So if you all have any challenges accessing the data or need it in a different format, please let us know. We want to make this a service to you all.
I would just add, specifically at the intersection of flood risk and social vulnerability, that is something that we're very interested in at DCR at the moment, and in generally, but it's something we're actively working on right now. So we are working with our consulting team at AECOM to kind of come up with a methodology for how, at a statewide scale across the Commonwealth, we should think about identifying underserved communities at flood risk, both primarily for informing our outreach and engagement for the plan development process, but additionally to inform again, that kind of state policy and programmatic strategy development. We're interested in, of course, where flooding occurs and what assets it impacts, but also, where that flooding is likely to impact our most underserved communities. So that's something that will, I'm sure, have additional information to be shared in the coming months, and certainly by the time that the statewide flood protection master plan is released. So do be on the lookout if that's something that's interesting to you for more information from us on that soon.
Yeah, I think to pile on to that, the data that is available right now is just coastal flood hazard intersected with social vulnerability using 2018 ACS data. We are updating this to include all major sources of flooding and to use updated social vulnerability data with 2020 census data. So that will be coming out by the end of the year. So depending on when you need this, just note what's available now isn't the complete picture, but it's a good start. But more is coming for the 8 coastal PDCs later this year.
And I did just,
oh, yep, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I dropped a link in the chat to the Flood Story app, if anybody's interested in checking that out.
And I don't see any other questions in at the moment, so I will just say to wrap us up, I mean, you feel free to drop any final questions in, attendees, at this point, but I'd just like to thank Matt and Carolyn for their time this afternoon and for their great presentation. I think it was really informative, and obviously we've had a lot of engagement from attendees. So thank you for answering everyone's questions. And I know, as you mentioned a few times, you're happy to be a resource in understanding the data and in sharing the data. So thank you. All attendees, you will see a follow-up email in the coming days, which will include the link to the recording and to the slide deck and the contact information as well. But feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about the webinar series as a whole. And also come to Williamsburg in July if you'd like to hear Carolyn speak some more. I believe that presentation will be on integrating resilience planning into everyday, or resilience into everyday planning. Is that correct?
Yes, that is the topic of the session. And it's more people than just me talking about flood resilience as well. It's not, I'm one of several great panelists, so.
Well, thank you very much, Matt and Carolyn. We really appreciate it. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.